This is the Demystifying Mental Toughness podcast, hosted by David Charlton, and you're listening to this podcast to help you build your own mental toughness, or so that you can support other people or your clients better. Either way, you will learn more about developing this plastic personality trait that all but guarantees that you will perform better and lead a more prosperous life. Welcome back to the Demystifying Mental Toughness podcast. Today we're looking at episode 216. And as I'm recording this short intro, it's a wild and it's a windy Newcastle upon Tyne. Last week we had cold temperatures, freezing cold temperatures, -3, -4, lots of ice and harsh frosts. Well, this week it's the wind by the looks of it and the elements. And you know, if we think about our goals and what we want to achieve in 2024, we're also likely to be faced with some battles, with some elements. Perhaps there's going to be some obstacles in our path, injuries, losses of form, loss of confidence, some slumps there. There might be some technical difficulties along the way too, relationship issues and stuff off the pitch or off the course. And you know, often what can happen as a highly committed person, the highly committed athlete, well, they can fall into some traps. They can become reactive. They can work too hard, if you like. And they can get carried away by the stress of it all. And if they've got coaches who continually push them with very high standards, well, they can really get sucked in too. So, this episode, well, it's about building some good habits for 2024. Some sustainable habits that will help you stay committed in the long term. Last week, Fenwick Ridley talked about cold immersion and its benefits when it comes down to rest and recovery and that extra 1% you could have on your performances and your well-being for that matter. Then we had Ellen McDermott the week before who looked at nutrition, and she gave some excellent principles there around nutrition and again how that can aid your recovery. So this episode, well, it follows a similar theme as I go back 201 episodes and I take a short bite out of episode 15 where well-esteemed strength and conditioning coach Nick Grantham talks to me about rest and recovery and how you could go about this. He talks about the differences between individual and team sports and how you as a person could go about selecting what things can really aid your rest and recovery so that you stay in peak condition over the long haul.
So I think when you're working with individuals, so individual sports are often groups of individuals and they still train together, which is, you know, if you took something like rowing or track and field, they would be an individual sport, but they still train as a training group. Again, things like tennis, golf, it probably is more like an individual, an N of one on tour. And I think the benefits of that is that you can then really start to work out what are the recovery rituals and routines that work for that player. So there are certainly routines that you want to establish that are backed by science and evidence-based that work, but we shouldn't neglect the rituals that a player may have that may on first inspection not seem scientifically validated, but they put that player in a good place from a wellness and a recovery perspective. So I think when you're working with real individuals, it helps you tailor specifically for their needs. The challenge you have with team sports or individuals that train as a team is then almost a kind of a one-size-fits-all. So match day +1, we're now going to go into recovery and it's going to be some low-level aerobic work. It's going to be hydrotherapy, flexibility, mobility. And whilst all of those may be validated in the science, if you've got a squad of 25, it's inevitable that there's going to be people in there that some of that works for them and for others it doesn't. So I think there is potential for the individual to get lost within the group environment.
In that respect, for the team sport player, then is it then up to them to invest on a individual basis in order to improve the rest and recovery? I can't remember which basketball player it is, but I'm sure in the States is like one of the famous guys. He's investing something like $1 million a year in this.
I'm being on his support team. I think what you find is that the athletes do start to understand what allows them to be in a good place post-match, post-tournament, post-competition. And if as an organisation you provide a fairly generic or what I talk about in terms of training and recovery is collective individualisation, you provide strategies that you know are going to work for the group on the whole, and then allowing opportunities to individualise those strategies. So, there may be an athlete that feels, look, cold immersion is just not for me. And if anything, it increases my stress response. So are we going to force them to do an ice bath? Or do we say, okay, well, here's a menu of options, and we could even give them a points system, which is something I've done in the book, and say, look, you need to get 20 points out of today. You choose the selection of activities that give you the 20 points. So that then creates some autonomy with the athlete. And again, if an athlete's got autonomy, they're probably going to buy into the session and the recovery that you're putting in place much more than if we just said, you've got to do this, this, and this. So I know the teams that I work with, we try and provide a menu. Here are the non-negotiables. These are the 3 things that we want you to complete. And then if you would rather go and do a recovery jog instead of a recovery bike, that's fine. Let's make that on an individual basis and make a decision on that day.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That does. When an athlete takes to the field in that chosen sport, naturally you want them to be in a highly motivated place, as relaxed as they're likely to be, and with that sense of self-belief, confidence in their ability. So I can certainly see how that fits by having the individual approach.
I know with one of the downhill mountain bikers I worked with in previous years, categorically did not want to do ice baths because she was just like, look, it puts me in a place that's it's not recovering for me. Let's look at some alternatives. So, we did look at strategies, and whilst we may feel that was the optimal intervention for her, it was 100% not the thing to do. So let's not get you doing that, because we're saying counteracting the very things we're striving for.
So you'll have to often ask yourself the question, is this helping the athlete ultimately, and is this going to impact positively on their performance? Yeah,
I think with training interventions, with anything that you put in place, I think over the years, I've probably matured as a coach. And previously, where it was like, I would be telling you what to do because I know best, I've come to the realization athletes know very well. They've been doing their sport and activity for decades before we turn up and say, oh, actually, I think you should change X, Y, and Z. So I think listening to the athlete about what works and developing a strategy together that allows them to be in a good place is a great starting point. And then the recovery pyramid that I developed with Mark Jarvis, one of my colleagues, gives us that foundation. There's 4 levels to it, and at each level there's a variety of strategies, and that gives you almost like a hierarchical structure of interventions. But then running through the pyramid is this mortar that holds it all together, which is that individual focus and personal take on it. So, at all times, these are our strategies, but recognizing for this individual, actually, maybe we're going to bypass level 1 and go straight to a level 4 intervention as an idea.
Do you want to tell me a little bit more about that pyramid?
Yeah, so it came out of confusion, really. So in about 2002, 2003, I think we were doing stuff with England netball, and then that wasn't a really mainstream sport, but Paula Radcliffe, I think she won a world championships, and then the England rugby won the World Cup, and they were using ice baths. So all of a sudden you saw this massive overreaction in sport, and everyone started getting into recovery. And what we saw at the English Institute of Sport when I was working there with Mark Jarvis was everyone was chucking like every potential intervention at an athlete. And it was a bit of a scattergun approach and just chuck stuff at the wall and see what sticks. And it didn't make sense to us as strength coaches, because if we're going to write a training program, there's a logical sequence that you would follow and kind of foundations that you need to lay. And that's where we came up with this idea of the recovery pyramid, was to try and make sense of all of this noise and find out what would be the logical structure. So we developed 4 levels. The first level being looking at sleep, nutrition, and body management. And we felt those were 3 fundamental things that athletes should be working on before they go to the level 2. And level 2 was looking at more around periodization, reactive programming, and ongoing monitoring. So real simple stuff like levels 1 and 2 is like your basics. Before you get onto level 3, where you'll be looking at your hydrotherapies, compression garments, muscle stim, and then your top end would be sort of stress diagnostics, psychological interventions, and environmental interventions, and cryotherapy. So we laid it out and we've revised it a few times, and I've kind of condensed it down to a recovery cycle, and it's just those bottom 3. Because for me, look after your sleep, look after your nutrition, and take care of your body management, which is how you recover, flexibility, mobility. And if you've got those 3 things dialed in, then you can start to think about, okay, do we use some compression garments? Do we use some cryotherapy? But what we were seeing back in the early 2000s, where athletes were doing all these sophisticated interventions, and they're kind of putting a cherry on top of a cake that didn't really exist. Mm-hmm. So that's why we came up with the idea, was try and make some sense of it for ourselves. And interestingly, as the research is coming out, probably those lower level interventions, there's more and more evidence to come out and support sleep, nutrition, flexibility, mobility, body management type things. And your higher level strategies, the research is probably more sparse and not as solid. It's not to say you shouldn't use them or apply them, but you've got to consider carefully what's the cost benefit when you're using it.
Well, it was great to listen back to that episode there. Nick provides some fantastic value. And if you want to hear more about that, I would suggest that you go to episode 15, where he talks in a lot more detail about the principles around rest and recovery. I certainly found it a fascinating episode, as have a lot of the listeners. And it doesn't matter if you're an athlete, a coach, or whatever profession you're in, you can certainly take some elements that are going to help you in the long term. It's very easy to get stuck on the treadmill, if you like, and keep going and going and going, and then find you running on empty, or perhaps at about 50 or 60%. So I sincerely do hope that Nick's ideas about this hierarchical structure and how you can go about choosing things that can really help your own rest and recovery are a big help. I certainly know it has been for myself when I'm passing on little bits of advice to the people that I work with. So, until next week, please do keep your eyes open for tomorrow's Mental Edge newsletter, where I put a lot more detail in about rest and recovery to be able to help you. And if you haven't already signed up to the Mental Edge newsletter, please do check it out in the show notes. Have a great week.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Demystifying Mental Toughness podcast with David Charlton, do check out my website, sport-excellence.co.uk, and my online sport psychology resources. The Sport-Excellence website has essential resources for anyone looking to build their own mental toughness or the mental toughness of their athletes or teams, or if you want to achieve peak performance more often or optimal functioning. The Sport Excellence website has everything you need to keep moving forward and thrive. So go on, head over to sport-excellence.co.uk to find out more.